Without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you all the second speaker in our innovation session of this 2020 DRF Symposium, Nick Bullock. Nick Bullock has 20 years of experience working with farmers to review their current farm practices. As an ex-dairy farmer, he really understands farmers' perspectives and barriers to change. You know, he's worked in the dairy, beef, oyster, pig, poultry, and also with farmers using irrigation. And his projects range from energy efficiency, renewable energy, whole farm planning, farm mapping, dairy effluent, irrigation, pumping, and reticulation systems. So really a breadth of expertise there. But the focus of this presentation from Nick today is on energy opportunities for dairy farmers. So Nick, welcome to the symposium, and the stage is yours.
Thanks, Cameron. Yeah, I'd like to talk about the energy opportunities for dairy farmers, and specifically I was going to run through some of the work, the detailed analysis work that's been carried out by a DPI project called the Energy Efficiency Solutions Project. I can't share it. Can you see that?
Yes, that's fine.
Great. Okay, sorry. So I just wanted to run through a few opportunities for dairy farmers, but rather than have a general talk, so look at some of the resources that have been completed by the New South Wales DPI through a project called the Energy Efficiency Project. So part of the project, this project is to provide real world examples of new energy technologies and equipment that actually work. And there is an extension program to help farmers, you know, with training and awareness. But I want to focus on this first part of it because I think there are some interesting lessons we can learn. So initially, the program advertised for expressions of interest for projects that could demonstrate the application of new technology in the energy world, especially those that were showed innovation and had wide application. So there were 20 applications from farmers and farming groups on this, and out of those 20, 10 went to full feasibility through the program. So engineering consultants looked at those projects and developed full feasibility study reports. Part of that program process also resulted in some case study that came out of that, and that we distributed to farmers through the extension program. But it's these feasibility studies that I'd like to talk a bit about today. The final part of the program will be to fund 5 pilots from these studies to really demonstrate on the ground energy technologies that can work on dairies and other agricultural enterprises. And there'll be ongoing monitoring of those pilots once they're up and running, not just on the technical side, but also how farmers have coped with these changes as well. Now, I'm going to run through the 5 case studies, the feasibility studies that relate to dairy. But if you're interested and there are things that you want to get more detail on, then I'm sure Mike Cashin, who runs the program, and John O'Connor, who runs the extension program, will be more than happy to give you the case studies and more information. There are 5 feasibility studies that relate to dairy. One's on thermal storage, which was proposed by Dairy New South Wales and has been studied by Pitt & Sherry, consulted in Sydney. There's one on battery storage. I'll go through each of these in a bit more detail later. There's one on battery storage, Agrivoltex, one on biogas, and one on virtual microgrids. So the thermal storage, the idea was, you know, in dairies, a lot of solar PV is not greatly used in the dairy, typical dairy situation. And this is a graph which sort of demonstrates that. So this graph here is kilowatts either produced by the solar or used by the dairy. And the red line shows the typical energy use by dairy. So you've got the peak in the morning milking, during the day, not a lot's going on, and then you've got a peak in the afternoon, and then overnight you've got hot water being heated. Whereas if we compare it to the blue line, which is the solar production, that sort of peaks in the middle of the day, and there's a big area here which is not utilized by typically by the dairy a dairy operation. So the idea was to sort of capture some of that cheap or solar energy with chilled water. So that, and to do that using a chiller with glycol and a plate cooler. So to chill that water when power is cheap, either overnight, or if you've got solar power, using solar power. So in this chilled water, we're storing cheap energy or free energy through the solar power. So that all this happens when outside milking times. So during milking, when the milk comes in through your first plate cooler, so rather than going into the vat at sort of 20, 24 degrees, it goes through a second plate cooler and is chilled by the chilled water, and will go into the vat at sort of 6 to 8 degrees. So we're using this cheap stored energy to reduce our energy use in the vat. Now this is a template. So Pitt and Sherry, who did the feasibility study, and they developed a template. I don't want to go through the template. I just want you to know there is a template which can be utilized by other farmers to develop their own process and their own system. And it goes into a lot of detail about the logic and the temperatures that you can achieve. The other thing I should mention, there is a reasonable amount of energy saving that can be achieved through heat recovery on the refrigeration plant. So there are a couple of factors and key innovations in this program. So the system template was designed to use readily available equipment found in dairies. So initially they started to look at ice banks, which require a lot smaller storage, but the equipment required is quite different to what's readily available on dairies. It's sort of unique to ice banks, and there's a very high cost. So the route taken was to use readily available equipment on farms. The other key innovation is control logic required to optimize the system function. So for example, in the morning, we don't want the chiller to be turned on before there's sufficient amount of solar energy generated by the PV. So there needs to be some control over that. In the past, this might have been done by PLCs, programmatic logic controls, but this has been a barrier in the past because they fail and they have complications in getting them fixed. With the use of smart switches and the Internet of Things, there's potential for some of these barriers to be lifted. And the third thing is the solar PV was sized to deliver about 30 to 60% of the chiller needs. And this was deliberate rather than oversizing the solar to maximize the use of the solar as a solar actually used. So what are the results? So there were 5 farms involved, cow size, herd size ranging from 180 to sort of 600 cows. The solar PV that was designed by Pitt and Sherry ranged from probably smaller than you think, from 10 to sort of 70 kilowatt hours. There was one farm which already had solar in place, so the system was designed around that. The costs, so the costs range from sort of $80,000 up to $250,000. That's the solar PV, but also all the other equipment required on farm to make the system work, such as refrigeration, plate coolers, etc. The savings range from about $10,000 up to about $30,000 per year, depending on, and this included the energy savings, so the refrigeration and the hot water, but also other savings such as reduced pickup times or improved milk quality. So the payback times for these projects came from about 5 up to about 9 years. So, if 5 years is getting there, but 9 or 10 years is probably a bit on the longer side. So these projects might be more suitable for when the equipment's reaching its end of life and you're making a decision what to replace it with. So rather than replace it with same old, look at options. Another project that was looked at through a feasibility study was battery storage. And this was done for 2 small producers, boutique dairy producers, by Northmore Gordon. The concept here was some energy efficiency upgrades, but also solar and flow batteries. And so I put this slide up about flow batteries, not because I want to talk about flow batteries, but they wanted to use flow batteries because they're more recyclable. And so there's more green credentials for these small producers, but they are more expensive than normal batteries. And obviously that's going to affect your payback periods. So these payback for these systems with solar and the batteries came out to sort of 11 to 17 years. So obviously batteries are starting to push out your payback periods. So unless you've got a real need for batteries, so in other words, these farms wanted to reduce their reliance on the grid and also improve their, reduce their blackouts and burnout impacts, then it's very hard to justify batteries. The third feasibility study was about Agrivoltex for Fara School at Tamworth and conducted by a 2XC consultant. Agrivoltex is the installation of solar panels on a raised platform above agricultural land. And the idea is that land under the panels can be used for pasture. So potentially large-scale solar farms can coexist with agriculture. So it's not one or the other. And maybe it could be adapted in dairies for cow shade areas, such as on feed pads and yards. The Fara Project wanted to use this on their irrigation system, to power their irrigation system, but 3 of their irrigation pumps were diesel, so then it required electrification of the energy pump, irrigation pumps, and it involved the installation of a 60 kilowatt single axis solar PV tracking system. And they're using tracking systems because they allow some sunlight to penetrate the land below at different times of the day to allow that pasture growth. So the costs for these this project, the system upgrades were 275,000. The solar PV and the tracker was about 90,000, so a total of 365,000. Savings of energy savings of 43,000. The labour saved and also the maintenance of the diesel was about 25,000, giving 68,000. So a payback of about 5.5 years. Now, you'll notice there's a big range of payback periods, and obviously payback is related to what you're paying for power now, but also what you pay for equipment, if so solar and batteries and whatever. And what we found on all these projects, there's enormous range of both those, cost of power and cost of equipment. The fourth feasibility study was looking at biogas and how that might be used for dairies. Now, Silverman Dairy is out at Cara, and Data Consulting looked at this option. So Silverman milks 320 cows. It's got 60 cows and 95 heifers on a facility 24/7. So if there's a medium-sized dairy in the state that biogas might work, it's going to be this one because there's a lot of manure going down into the effluent system. The electricity use is about 420,000 kilowatt hours a year, but a fair portion of that is used from solar, an existing solar PV system. So it's about 264,000 from the grid. But not a lot of this is heat energy. So the concept was to maximize the electricity generated by the biogas. So involved a covered anaerobic lagoon with some scrubbing and biogas treatment, putting it through a generator, the methane through a generator to generate electricity on site. Now, other heat recovery options were considered, for example, absorption chillers, but they were discounted because the technology couldn't achieve sufficiently low temperatures to integrate with the existing refrigeration plant in the dairy, which was ice bank. Now, often on these biogas systems, you'll see CHPs or combined heat and power units, but this was not considered viable in this case because a lot of the energy, the heat energy, was delivered by the heat recovery unit on the chillers in the dairy. So how did it stack up? The electricity generated from the biogas potentially could produce 270 to 740 kilowatt hours per year from the methane. And that's a huge range. Now, unfortunately, a sample wasn't taken of the effluent. And so these are theoretical production values. Ideally, if you're going to go down this track, you need to do some samples to know exactly where you sit on this range. So the data consulting looked at the solution using a 60 kilowatt capacity Toyota gas engine, and this would generate 242,000 kilowatt hours a year. So it's on the lower end of this potential from the methane gas. Now this would replace 92% of the grid usage in the dairy. So the costs, so the bottom line is about $950,000 to put a system like this in. The benefits, the savings, so in energy are about $48,000. So the Australian credits, carbon credits, after you take the administration fees off, is about 9,500. And there's obviously, you've got to run the biogas system. It doesn't run itself. So the cost of about 14,500. So net about 43,000. So the payback, 22 years. So that's for this site. So you can see in the cost, there's quite a contingency, and also quite a cost for building the pond. So you can imagine in a case where ponds were of a reasonable, the right size for the cover the anaerobic lagoon, and you can get your contingency down. This might get down to sort of, $600,000. Even then, with these sort of savings, it's a sort of 14-year payback. The final project that we had a feasibility study done for was virtual microgrids. And this was for Riverina Fresh and 5 of their farmers. It was carried out by Energetics. So the idea here is we've got 3 parts of the jigsaw. We've got a buyer, Riverina Fresh, we've got a retailer, and we've got the farmers. So these 3 need to come up to an agreement on what they pay for power, and what they'll pay for fed-in power, and the fees for the retailer. So basically, any surplus and generation by the farmer that's put into the grid is monitored by the retailer and pays the farmer for that export on behalf of Riverina Fresh. So in terms of Riverina Fresh, or the buyer, they purchase energy just the same, but they'll pay the farmer for the agreed rate. So potentially it could be a good second income stream for farmers, particularly if the agreed rate is reasonable, sort of 20-25 cents. So the results of this, depending on the size of the system, were between 7 to 9 years. But for this particular site, there are a number of constraints. One is the distance between the farm and the processor, Riverina Fresh, was about 200 kilometres. So they would have to use the grid to as a network. And so, unfortunately, where they are in that Finlay area, it's got what's called electrically weak. There's no capacity to support additional renewables. So it's unlikely in that area something like this could go ahead. We would also need an AMO registered retailer to facilitate the peer-to-peer energy trading. Now, at the moment, Riverina Fresh uses tier 1 retailer, which is the highest size retailer, so they're going to get the lowest energy cost out there. But you're probably going to need a tier 3 retailer, which is probably not going to be able to offer the same sorts of costs to Riverina Fresh, which means their costs probably go up. And Riverina Fresh are on a commercial contract, so they pay for network fees and retail fees, and only the retail costs can be passed through, which is about 9.5 cents. So better paybacks might be achieved by linking purchases, such as groups of houses that have high demands in daylight hours, to suppliers. So the conclusions are the paybacks for all the projects were relatively long, sort of greater than 6 years. And to me, this sort of indicates that careful appraisal of costs and savings is essential when you're considering investments in any of these new energy technologies. because the savings and the paybacks depend on the site, the existing equipment, the existing energy costs, and what you're paying for the infrastructure. And it might be worth looking at your energy efficiency options first, because not only can they save you money, but also reduce your overall demand, so therefore reduce the size of any renewables that you might need to put in. So it'd be worth considering energy opportunities at the end of life of equipment rather than simply replacing existing. Now, that probably means formulating a plan of action before the equipment fails, so for when it does fail. So thank you, that's it.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's always hard giving a presentation without the applause at the end, but trust me, there is some applause out there. And Nick will obviously have questions in the panel discussion towards the end. Very, very clear presentation there, so thank you so much. Nick, and I'm sure there's going to be some questions there, and I'd encourage everyone online there to use the Q&A. Thank you so much to John, Mizanur, and Jeremy for your questions, and don't worry, they will be asked in the discussion session that we have very shortly. Please, yes. Everyone else? Questions? Thank you so much. So last but not least, the final presentation for the symposium. Usually it's me,